We've been looking at the history of the counterfeit. What brought us to this study as preliminary understanding was revising the history of the world from their ploughing through to their harvest. And then we turned our attention to the counterfeit. So we have in the last presentations spoken about this proxy war, the compare and contrast between ancient Israel and ancient Babylon, the theocracy of ancient Israel, counterfeited in the theocracy of Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, and also into Rome. And then how they split. God split church and state in the dispensation of the early church, and it took the papacy 500 years, half a millennium, to counterfeit that, where by 538 you have this fully formed division between the church or the papacy and the state or the kings of Europe in that history. So it went from 500 years in that history to when we go into the history of World War II, 1 and 2, which we will be discussing. It's 100 years, and now we see that they are essentially, when we looked at 2013, compared and contrasted 2014, they now are overlapping, stepping on each other's toes, so to speak. So we laid out the history of modern Israel. We briefly touched on ancient Israel, and now we want to see the counterfeit as it is in modern Israel. We went to the history of the deadly wound. Again, another compare and contrast. We find God's church, and here we've used the model of 1850, 1863, but we could use any scenario. We could go back to ancient Israel and look at them prior to the 70 years captivity in Babylon. What we see is God's people, God's church, given a job function. They fail to fulfill that job function. They go into apostasy, Laodicean condition, which we defined as being distracted with just the ordinary tasks of life, not fulfilling our job function. Called that rebellion, and showed that the punishment of this was in a soon coming captivity or scattering. So 1850, the Laodicean condition, it's rebellion. 1863, they're punished with the 126. Scattering, captivity, and its punishment by their boss, who is God. We compared and contrasted that with Satan's church, and we showed how with Satan, he's also given them a job function. They have tasks they are meant to do, and what were their tasks in the history of the 1260? 2 tasks. What was the papacy to do in the history of 1260, my sister? I missed the last bit, sorry.
Their job function was to be accomplished through the Jesuit order.
So they have a job function during this 1260. It's to be accomplished through the Jesuit order. And what did the Jesuits do?
They were persecuting the Christians.
So kill God's people, persecute, and what else? One other. How could they kill God's people? How did they accomplish this, the persecution?
They accomplished it by controlling the things of men.
Yes. So they controlled state governments. They controlled the kings. by controlling the kings, they could use the kings against God's people. Does that make sense? So control the kings, kill God's or persecute God's people. That's the job function of the Jesuits. And then in 1773, the Pope decides that he would rather temporal prosperity than fulfilling that task. And he abolishes the Jesuit order. Just want to go to a Bible passage. Matthew 22. Starting in verse 1. And Jesus answered and spake unto them again by parables, and said, The kingdom of heaven is like unto a certain king, which made a marriage for his son, and sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding, and they would not come. Again he sent forth other servants, saying, Tell them which are bidden, Behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fatlings are killed, and all things are ready. Come unto the marriage. But they made light of it and went their ways, one to his farm, another to his merchandise. And the remnant took his servants and entreated them spitefully and slew them. But when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burnt up their city. So this parable, what's it telling us of? In brief, summarize this parable. Brother Robert.
About a king who, since he's arranging a marriage for his son, and then he begins to invite guests that all of them have coveted to invite the country on.
Who are the servants? Who is the king? So the king is God.
The servant should be his prophet, the people he uses.
We'll say prophets, we know who you mean. We'll say prophets, we know who you mean. What about all these other people that are bidden to the wedding? Who's that? Who is Jesus telling this to? So in that history, who do you think it is? Everyone okay with that? Does anyone disagree with this model? Everyone agrees with this model. So God, who are his people? God has a group of people and he sends them instructions through who? The servants. And what's the response of his people? What are their excuses for rejecting? My brother? What are their excuses for rejecting?
They want to get different work.
They have their different work. So one's going to his farm, one's going to his shop. They made light of his call, and they went about their daily business, their occupations. What does that sound like? Did somebody speak? Sorry? Fascism? I still can't hear, sorry. Profession. I knew you were. Covetousness. Okay, covetousness. Another word for? Laodicea. So it's a Laodicean condition. I think Brother Rogers spoke about it the other day as Laodicean covetousness. The chapter in Early Writings titled Covetousness. It's this worldliness, this distraction with our shops and our farms and our crops and building houses and getting married, and not the focus on the call of God. So God's people are in what? They're in a Laodicean condition. And that Laodicean condition is a preoccupation with prosperity, not even in a sense where we would look at it as extreme or wicked. You don't have to be wealthy to be preoccupied with prosperity or daily life. We're all okay with that. And what do they do to the prophets? Persecute them, kill them. So this parable is a model of God dealing with his church, yes? And his mechanism for interacting and dealing with them is through who? The servants. So if we take this model and we counterfeit it, what would it look like? Who's the king? Who's the boss? We'll forget about the marriage for now. It's not necessary for our point. Who are the servants? Who are his people? Dealing with this history, there are no conservatives, liberals here. Who are his people? The papacy, Catholics. So Satan, he sends his servants to the papacy, and what's the papacy preoccupied with in 1773? Israel is preoccupied with their prosperity. The papacy is preoccupied with their prosperity. All they care about is getting back their lands from the kings of Europe, making sure they can hold on to the wealth they've accumulated. They don't care about continuing persecution or continuing that control. So God's people persecuted and killed his prophets, and in this history, particularly from 1773 forward, the papacy persecuted and killed the servants sent to them by Satan. Where did the Jesuits flee, by the way? Because this wasn't just abolishing an order, they were kicked out of the countries. So if you were a Jesuit working in Uganda, they didn't just abolish your order, you're ordered to flee. Open persecution. Many of them killed. This wasn't just shutting down an order, it wasn't that simple. Where did they flee to? Who hid them and kept the Jesuits safe? Does anyone know that? Raise your hand. Anyone know where they fled to? Who kept the Jesuits safe until the papacy decided to re-establish the order? Just interesting trivia that we don't think about much, but I think it's worth noticing that they all fled to Russia. Russia kept them safe. So this is just another parable teaching of this history. You have God working through communicating to his nation through his prophets, and then you have them in a Laodicean condition rejecting his prophets. compared and contrast, you see the exact same model. 1773, abolishing of the Jesuits. 25 years later, they go into captivity. In Matthew 22, it describes the punishment. Verse 7, but when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burnt up their city. So who sent France against the papacy? Their boss, Satan. Is that fair? They persecuted and killed his servants. So he sent forth an army, destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. God sends the king of the north, Babylon. Satan took the king of the south, France. So we're all okay with that. Any other questions or thoughts on that point? My brother. No, I said I wasn't going to do that. Because going into defining this wedding is irrelevant to the point we want to make, the compare and contrast. So we're all in agreement so far. Now we get to the point of disagreement, where we left off last time. And that is beginning to deal with the resurrection. So we're all happy in seeing 1798, the deadly wound, death. When was the death? 1799. We're all comfortable with that. The part that we disagree on is the resurrection. Now, we had two different models people presented. Some people said this is the deadly wound and death of the papacy, but the resurrection is Protestantism. It's Protestantism that resurrects and does the work at the end of the world. Does anyone still hold to that? My brother. So what do you think this resurrection looks like?
Understand that it's going to be done by the Protestant churches.
So question, when did they resurrect?
They are resurrecting now, but they are not yet.
So if we were to go to Spalding and McGann, SPM 1.4, and I just want to paraphrase one sentence. She talks about the papacy, and then she talks about Protestantism, talking about the mother and the daughters. She says that the mother of harlots, the papacy, the mother is not the daughters, but she is separate and distinct from them. So can we conceptualize that? Sister Joy, would you come up the front, please? So you can see Sister Joy and I, we're distinct, yes? We're separate. I saw that the mother is not the daughters, but she is separate and distinct from them. She has had her day and it is past, and her daughters, the Protestants, are the next to come on the stage and act out the same mind that the mother had when she persecuted the saints. I saw that as the mother has been declining in power, the daughters had been growing in power, and soon they will exercise the power once exercised by the mother. So question, you have two separate and distinct entities, yes? Yeah. I'm the mother. I receive a deadly wound. I'm going down in the history of 1798 to 1799. At the same time, I'm going down in power Protestantism is rising in power, yes? You read that way? So I'm going down in power. Sister Joy is rising in power. My first question is, if I receive the wound, I'm declining in power, I die, yes? How can you say she's healed? She didn't get a wound. My brother.
Repeat the question.
I'm the mother, she's the daughter. We are separate and distinct from each other. I receive a deadly wound and I'm dying. And you know that she's not receiving a deadly wound or dying, because at the same time I'm dying, she's getting stronger. So how can she be healed from a wound I received? I received the deadly wound. You're saying she resurrects. How can she resurrect when she never died?
I don't know.
If you make it her, you have to know. Otherwise you can't say it's her, my sister at the back. Then when did it die? When did it die? If you resurrect, you died. When did she die? Then she can't resurrect. I'm not denying that. I'm saying, how can she resurrect when she didn't die? I died. And you can't even say she died in that history, because she's gaining in power as I'm losing power. So you don't then have a deadly wound, death, resurrection, which is the model that we're counterfeiting. We're seeing ancient Israel go into captivity, die in captivity, 70 years later come out of captivity. You need to show me that model in Protestantism. Brother Rogers. And isn't that what we read? The mother is separate and distinct from the daughters. So she has a separate and distinct experience. Any other thoughts or questions? Still, Brother Willie.
I was just thinking, if we can use comparing and contrast, we bring the line of Christ and we view the line of the papacy as the counterfeit. Then you will see that if the papacy dies in 1798, sorry, let me go just to the line of Christ to pick up a thought. So if you go to 4 BC, Christ is going to be born. And I'm saying at that point, divinity and humanity gets united. We have divinity plus humanity. So before 4 BC, how Christ is existing as only divinity without humanity. So what he gets in 4 BC, when he dies in 31 AD, we can see that he loses humanity, but the divinity remains. So my point is, what he gets at 4 BC is what he loses at 31 AD at the cross. So if we can compare and contrast that, and we come to 548, we have church and state coming together. That's when the papacy brings this state aspect. Sorry, I'm saying 548. So 50.
508.
So we have church and state coming together. And therefore I'm going to say at the death of that power, what is going to lose is what he had gained. And that is the state aspect of it.
So in 1798, you have the church lose the power of the state.
Yeah. So when we come to this line which we are comparing and contrasting, the line of Christ, when Christ resurrects, he resurrects with a glorified body. And again, so divinity didn't die, he only gains what he had lost when he's crucified. So I'm saying the papacy, when he died, he lost the state aspect. When he's going to resurrect, that is the only thing he's going to gain.
So at his birth, he's a combination of divinity and humanity.
Yeah.
That equals the birth of the papacy as a church-state union.
Yeah.
And then we see at his death,
He loses what he had gained at the path. For Christ is 31, the cross. So I'm saying Christ, what he had gained is humanity, and that is what he loses at the cross.
and you want to say that equals 1798?
Yeah. The papacy is going to lose what he had gained, just like Christ.
Because it can continue as a state.
Yeah.
As a church, can't continue as a state.
Yeah.
And this church is the papacy.
Yes.
So to resurrect, what does the papacy need to get back?
He needs to get what he had lost.
He needs to get back what he lost,
Yeah.
which is state power.
Yeah.
You don't have Christ lose humanity, die in that sense, and then resurrect as a different person.
Yeah.
He just needs humanity and divinity.
Okay, this is just some observation. According to the other model, we are marking death, but the deadly wound to be 1798, and the death to be 1799. To be consistent, why can we mark 1799, not 1798 to be the death? Because that one seems to contradict with 1798.
You receive a deadly wound, but death is a process. You receive Jesus is nailed to the cross, death was a process. You come to the Soviet Union, 1989, deadly wound. It died from 1989 to its death in 1991. It existed for another 2 years, just in a more and more feeble state. So all we're marking is the process here. Brother.
I just wanted to respond to him and say, even if you go to the history of Christ, you can see the 3 steps. I mean, Christ does not die instantly. He's crucified, what we can loosely mark as he receives the deadly wound. Then the next day, he stays in the tomb, now he dies, and then the 3rd day he resurrects. So I'm saying it's the same concept. He receives a deadly wound, he dies in 1789, and as some history is going to resurrect.
My brother.
Okay. I think we will go to Sister Wire, then it's clear that the mother and the daughter is separate. And what we want to do is to harmonize this concept we have, because we know that when we deal with the restriction, then we are going to, I think we have been comparing with the issue of King of the South and King of the North, and we see that King of the South, it was Egypt, and Egypt is going to die. And what we see that is going to come as a different body, and when it comes as a different body, it was praying. And we know that at the same time it's going to die, and when it comes, it's also come as a different body, and it's going to be righteous. So can we not follow that the same logic when we come to the King of the North? Because I hope that from the beginning you have been comparing the death of the King of the North and the death of the King of the South. And if that is the case, then you can see that from the line of King of the South is what is the same is the spirit and the body is different. And that is what we believe when we are going to be restricted. It's not the same body like those which are having defect on the body, maybe some which have lost their leg, when we are going to see is they are going to have that the same spirit, but the body is going to be different. So I'm seeing that, how do we harmonize this?
Are you content that when she discusses the history of 1888, that she sees that both Protestantism and the papacy exist in that history?
Come again?
In the history of 1888, you're happy to see that she's describing the Sunday law history where both the Protestantism is active and the papacy is active. You know all those quotes, it's just chapters of the Great Controversy. She's describing the Sunday law history. Protestantism is active, the papacy is active, yes?
I think the very people which are doing well with the state that is Protestant.
So you don't see in her quotes that the papacy is active. My brother.
Yeah, I'd like to confirm something from the quote you read. So the quote said that, then I saw the mother of harlots, that the mother was not the daughters, but separate and distinct from them. She has had her day, and it is past, and her daughters, the Protestant said.
You don't need to read it. I think we make that clear in this class. We've all read it. What's your point from it?
Yeah, what I see from the quote here is that the Protestant and the papacy do not work at the same time. At first, so was the mother. So, but now since the mother have died, so the restriction now will be the Protestant, so which are the daughters, according to the way I read this quote.
So you see absolutely no significance in 1989 and the union of Reagan and John Paul II. Church-state union took down the Soviet Union. That wasn't Protestantism.
What I was meaning is the quote only.
You see no significance in 1989.
I did not went to the history of 1989.
I'm taking you there. The history of 1989, you see no significance in Reagan and John Paul II, a church-state union. So if you're going to see papacy active in 1989, where we begin to thread every waymark since then, and the papacy went into a church-state union in 1989, are you content to say the papacy's had her day and is dead? You have 1989, the beginning of our reform line. You have papacy and you have Protestantism. You have John Paul II and you have Jerry Falwell, separate and distinct, both united with Reagan in different ways, both brought about the time of the end. Working at the same time with the same men.
So I don't deny that, but according to the way I look at this quote, it seems like the mother have died. So and the daughters now took the position of the mother. Also,
And this is written in history when slavery still exists. You're breaking your rules. If you go back to the context, this is 1850s, 60s history. The papacy in this history, what's her condition? She hasn't resurrected yet. My brother.
Okay, like what I'm seeing as a problem here, in the history of 1989 you can clearly see prophecy. But if you go to the line of Third Idolatry War, you see that there's a separation there. Right? So you see that prophecy has no link again with the king of the north, which is Antigonus, or United States. So in that sense that you see that they are totally separate. So the person who will be acting is Protestantism. So if it is true that papacy still have a role to play, then I think it's going to affect the model of Sunday law.
So Seleucus had nothing more to do with Antigonus after their alliance broke down. So you completely disregard the Babylonian War. The Babylonian War. A war between Antigonus and Seleucus.
Yeah, what I just saw there is that there is a war, because in that video you just say that there is a war in this model, but the end of it, it is Seleucid dynasty. But I do not understand what brought up
But you said that Seleucus had no more part to play.
Yeah, I did not see where they united.
And Seleucus fought. He was active in the whole of the Third Diadochi War, and then he goes to Babylon, he conquers Babylon, and he starts the Seleucid dynasty, defeating Antigonus. So if you go to the Third Diadochi War, it reinforces my point. It doesn't take away from it. Because you can't see Seleucus in 1989 being Protestantism. It's not Protestantism in 1989.
Because like in that line, I see that the king of the north is Antigonus, which is the type of the United States, and Seleucus was the army, right? Or which you are going to say that papacy is the army of the United States in that sense because it was not a power.
Seleucus was not the army of Antigonus.
He was a general.
Not of Antigonus. He was not a general of Antigonus.
Seleucus.
No, he was never a general of Antigonus. So if we come to 1989, we have Ronald Reagan. Who gets him elected? Jerry Falwell. Who helps him take down the King of the South? Separate and distinct from the mother. Can we all see that? Brother Rogers.
So I think if I want to use this quotation to argue the point that we don't see the papers playing a part in our history, I disagree. This quotation should be understood dispensationally to the time to which Ellen White was speaking. And I think if you go to that history, which you have said is the history of slavery, I think it's consistent that then it's just a few short years after the papers have died. If Christ were coming in that history, you may not have seen the papers play a role. But since then, a lot of time has gone, and you see the papers come to prominence. And I'm saying, if you want to use this quote literally to argue the point that the paper has no part in our history, I don't see it being consistent with the idea that we need to use these quotations dispensationally.
Reading Great Controversy. The papacy is just what prophecy declared that she would be. This is Great Controversy 571.2. The papacy is just what prophecy declared that she would be. So this is 1911 version, but I want to remind us it takes us back to 1888. The apostasy of the latter days, latter times. It is a part of her policy to assume the character which will best accomplish her purpose. But beneath the variable appearance of the chameleon, she conceals the invariable venom of the servant. Faith ought not to be kept with heretics, nor persons suspected of heresy. She declares, shall this power, whose record for 1,000 years is written in the blood of the saints, be now acknowledged as a part of the Church of Christ? This is just one quote to show that we're taking it out of context. If we read the papacy has had her day and that's over. I would suggest it's taking it out of context. Because you know in Great Controversy the papacy is active again. Do we have any other thoughts or questions? My brother.
Okay. The way I'm viewing this, that if I look into the history of 1260, which is the history of the mother, we can still see that the daughters have a role to play there in that history. And I can prove it with the quotation of Ellen White that the saints being persecuted in the period of 1260 years, we can see some Protestant churches persecuting those saints. And yet it is period of the mother, and the daughters has not yet played their work or their role. Coming now to our history, I can only see that scenario also that the time period is period of Protestant, which is a period of daughters, and the mother also can play the same role that was played by the daughters in their time. And the fact remains that the time periods belong to the daughters, as it was in the time period of 1260 years, that the period was for the mother. So in 1989 you can see both, but even in the quotes that we read before, if you go to page 2, paragraph 1, Ellen White is going to say that the nominal church will betray us to Catholics, and the Catholics there is the mother. So you can see that still these Protestants, they have to join themselves with mother in order for their work to be accomplished well. And this we can all see now in the United States, that Protestants have united also with Catholics, to bring up Donald Trump. But I'm saying the issue of name now matter, that this period is allocated to the doubters, though mother is playing some role there. That's how I'm saying it.
What period?
The period of the resurrection. Because we know that there is a period that this beast is gone, and the time that she is not, and the time that she is going to come. So the time that she is going to come is defined to be Sandelo. This is when it is fully resurrected. But before that, she has to begin some process of resurrection. That's what we were seeing in 1989.
It still needs to be explained how Protestantism can resurrect when it never received a deadly wound.
What they resurrect is the mother, but in different body. There's no quote that says the Protestant will resurrect.
She's writing that in 1850s, and she says they're separate, distinct bodies.
Yeah.
So Protestantism, don't you think it's active in 1850? 1850 is the Sunday law for their reform line. Protestantism has to be well alive by then. And even in that history, she says they're separate and distinct. So it can't die in the body of the mother and resurrect in the body of the daughters. You don't have separate and distinct people. My brother at the back.
Okay, I'm saying the mother may be there, but what matters here is who is playing the leading role. As we speak with the Protestants that are maybe bringing Christ and his faith together, you can quote himself, he's saying Trump is Hitler. He does not like what the Protestants are doing. So I don't understand if you said that the leading role will be played by the
Can you repeat that last bit? I didn't quite understand.
Oh, okay. I was saying what is happening in the United States, the coming together of church and state.
Mm-hmm.
The Pope is not in favor. He even calls Trump Hitler. That means he does not like.
So Francis doesn't like Trump and what's happening. I get that.
Trump will treat that Trump is the president that will maybe enact the something law. And if so, the Pope of the Catholic Church is not in agreement with Trump. So I don't see any point in saying that the Catholic Church, the mother, will be the one bringing together church and state. So I'm saying the Protestants are the ones playing the leading role. The mother may be there, but
If the mother is there, she's alive, isn't she? No. Really. If I died and you put me in a grave, which is a bottomless pit, and then you see me again, you know I've come out of that pit. Because the imagery is all about wounding, death, and resurrection. If you see the papacy, she must have come out of that grave, yes? Then you can't say they're both there. My brother. If we can have quiet, please, while he's...
I'm going to answer the question of previous that you asked, not the present one, that if you die and daughter are the one working, if they don't die together with you, how comes that they resurrect? And then here we support you that if you get a deadly wound, your daughter also has got a deadly wound. So for them to resurrect, or for them to be seen, they must resurrect.
That's why I wanted to highlight the fact that she says that Protestantism is strengthening as the deadly wound is doing its work.
Yeah, that is the point I'm going to.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were arguing with me, but you're...
I will not agree that in 1798, as the papacy get the deadly wound, the Protestants were coming up. I'm not going to agree that, but I'm going to say, as it gets a deadly wound, it should die, and then start resurrection takes place. But if you say it gets a deadly wound in 1798, and at the same point, it has not yet died, and somebody is saying the Protestants are now resurrecting, or the daughters are resurrecting, I don't agree at that point. So it should get a deadly wound first, die, So I just want to put that point that it is wrong to say at 1798 the daughters are what? Resurrecting, because the mother has not yet died. The mother has just gotten a dead people.
So I liked that point. We can't say that Protestantism is resurrecting after 1798 because the mother isn't even dead yet. Does that make sense? Brother Dennis.
So I was trying to think about some principles we take from the Bible. I was trying to think about Elijah, the Tishbite. So we know there is a conflict between Elijah and a threefold union between Jezebel, who is a symbol of the papacy, and who is married to Ahab. You can see a church and state relationship, but you can also see the prophets of Baal. So I just took my mindset to a point where Elijah was, where he was fighting against the prophets of Baal. So in that story, it's one Elijah fighting against many prophets, and Jezebel was not there. Then I came to the story of John the Baptist, and I was trying to see Salome. She is entertaining the audience. The Herod has invited the princess, and I was trying to see that in this story, the mother is there because Salome will be asked, tell me what you want, because she entertains the king. And what does she go and do? She goes and asks Herodias what she should ask from the king. So I was trying to see that if I combine the two stories, to me, I think they are trying to teach us two things. Like the story of Elijah, you don't see the woman, you don't see the whore. So on one aspect, you must see that God is trying to tell us to focus on the daughter. But on another aspect, God wants us to see that the three of them are still there and in agreement.
So for the camera, our brother has taken us to Elijah, the prophets of Baal and Jezebel, and the history of Herodias and Herod and Salome to show the existence of both entities. My brother, you haven't spoken.
Okay, so when I look on the line, I'm seeing that there's a place whereby you can see on the line that poverty is respected. And the point that brother brought up was when person dies, respect in a different form. So when I'm looking to that, take that concept and apply it papacy. So I'm trying to conceptualize what you're saying, like what you have established that papacy in the time that we are living now is liberal. Like you're not conservative to the belief that you had before. So I'm trying to see that papacy respect in a form whereby that liberal ideas, which is like contradicting the form that they had before. So when we look at that, I can see that it's respected by a different form or different ideology rather than the ideal that you had before. Which you can see and you connect them, like Protestant are so conservative with the belief that they had before. And if Catholic is going to be conservative with the belief that they had before, I don't see the way that they're going to come together. Unless one person change, they're going to meet at the end.
So you've given us the problem and no solution. Sister Solange, what are your thoughts?
I think that we can see advantages and two powers. We have to recognize before that the papacy representative don't have two powers. And that's what the mother and what the daughter. We have like a I saw like a transition of power that it's like a teaching dispensation and that's
So you see that there are two separate and distinct mother-daughters, but that there is a transition in power where the daughters start to work here. What's your point? The mother is dead. In the history of the mother being dead, the daughters are active. Sister Beatrice, your thoughts?
the mother dies, and then the daughter grows up,
So the daughters are copying the mother, but they are not the resurrected form of the mother. My brother.
I would like to educate myself by so saying that if I'm to identify the point of resurrection for the papacy, I would be tempted to put it at 1989 or prior to 1989. After that is the point that I see now the daughters are trying to come up, or the papacy is trying to see how to gain what is lost, according to Brother William statement that by the time Christ died, he lost humanity, and by the time the papacy lost the power, he lost the state, and it is at 1989 that I see papacy trying to gain the relationship or gain the state together, so I would be tempted to put the resurrection at 1989.
So I just want to comment on that history. In 1979, it's the first time a pope has been allowed to visit Washington, D.C. Before, when a president met a pope, they would meet in separate cities, or I think at the very beginning, hotel rooms even. Never meet at the center of American government, because they have been so suspicious of the papacy ever since they came out of Europe. So in 1979, it's the first time, and it's John Paul II visits Washington, center of American government. He immediately begins working, or soon after then, particularly in the history of 1981-82, after they both have an assassination attempt, he begins working with Reagan. And then in 1989, together, this union of papacy plus the United States takes down the Soviet Union. Is that all okay? So that's essentially what you said. I would just place I don't want to use the terms resurrection. For me, that becomes problematic. But if you want to see the papacy working, then yes, it would be in the history particularly from 79 to 89. This is when it's impacting the United States. And we know that this is our 10-year history. So we look at this 10 years, and what else do we place in this 10 years? We place the moral majority and Jerry Falwell, and that is Protestantism, yes? So separate and distinct from the mother is the daughters. You have Protestantism. They have gone into a union with Reagan, didn't they? They got him elected. So you have the daughters from 79 to 89 in union with Reagan. You have John Paul II. 79, Reagan isn't yet president, but he's already beginning to work with America. 79 to 89, impacting America, right at the seat of government. Does that make sense? They're doing separate work, separate and distinct from each other, both relevant to our time of the end. And we know at the time of the end, how do we understand it? It's our right hand, and the thumb is the time of the end. And then to understand a waymark like the Sunday law, what do we have to do? Thread every single waymark. And for me, I can't understand how that works if we want to see at the time of the end United States being impacted by Protestantism and the papacy. And then we just want to leave one thread and only take another. Because they don't merge, they're two separate threads at the time of the end. There was a hand over here. Yes, brother.
Okay, the reason why I'm seeing people are arguing, I think the issue is...
Not arguing, just a discussion.
Yeah, it is argument. Exactly, it's a discussion. Okay. So what I'm seeing, which we have not understood, is what do we mean by the days of papacy? Because I was hearing you talking about Protestant as a daughter working. The other days mean that the Catholic or papal church was closed? Or what do you mean by papacy not working? Because in that history, I'm seeing all of them, they are like active as church. And when
In what history, sorry?
in the history of 1790,
In this history?
1798. In 1798, I think the Catholic Church was still working, as other Protestants were still. So we have to give the definition of what that date means, so that we understand what happened there.
So it's getting a little full. I'll do it up here. Two time of the ends, right? You have 1798 to 1799. Deadly wound and death of who?
I can say King of the North.
So then we're going to compare and contrast that with 1989 to 1991. Deadly wound and death of the King of the South. So Russia didn't stop operating after 1991, did they? Russia's still operating as a nation after 1991. So what does that death look like? What did they lose that signifies death, Sister Solange? A dream? Sleep? When the wound is healed? Healing? Okay. Brother Willie, where are you? You're the one that brought us to this deadly wound death scenario. So what does the death look like? Because when you said death, you said it was the separation of the church from the state, so the church lost its power.
Yeah. I mean, for me, how I conceptualize the death is when he loses the state power. That is what he lost in 1798.
So the church lost its state power, Brother Rogers, and then the brother next to you.
I still miss some point, that's why I raised my hand. There was a point by the time we were discussing from that 1979 to 1989, you said we don't want it to be to bring more problems. We don't use exaggeration. So for me, I still have other answer or some other point. But if I don't understand, if we are not using the term exaggeration, which term should I use there?
I think I asked yesterday if you're all familiar with the study of the counterfeit, the comparing and contrasting, and I think you said you weren't familiar with that specific study. So it's because of that study that I don't term this resurrection, just because I'm trying to be specific with it. But I don't want to dispute the term. I'm not trying to argue a point about that. Hopefully when we do that study, we'll step our way through that and it might make more sense. Brother Rogers.
So the question was, after 91, when the Soviet Union dies without Russia, I think it's the same scenario when you come to the Sunday law. Russia is the nation is operating in the world. But what does it Sunday law, Russia is still operating as a nation, what it has lost is its prophetic role as the king of the south. No longer has that part in prophecy. It is gone by the time because we say at the Sunday law, the king of the south receives a red ruler premium, dies at the Sunday law. So it's just operating, it's just like another nation. It has no part in prophecy.
So what did the Soviet Union lose? Spheres of influence? It lost its states, didn't it? Did the papacy ever have states? When did it lose its states? It's progressive over time, particularly 1870. This is just Wikipedia. The Papal States were a series of territories in the Italian peninsula under the direct sovereign rule of the Pope. From the 8th century until 1870, they were among the major states of Italy from roughly 800 AD. They were conquered. At their zenith, the Papal States covered most of the modern Italian regions, and it starts listing the regions including the city of Rome. These holdings were considered to be a manifestation of the temporal power of the Pope. So they're a manifestation of his state power, and it says as opposed to his ecclesiastical primacy. So they're a symbol, the Papal States are a symbol of his state power as opposed or in contradiction to his, is separate to his church power. By 1861, much of the Papal States' territory had been conquered by the Kingdom of Italy. Only Lazio, including Rome, remained under the Pope's temporal control. In 1870, the Pope lost Lazio and Rome and had no physical territory at all, except the Basilica of St. Peter and the Papal residence, and related buildings around the Vatican quarters of Rome, which the new Italian state did not occupy militarily. And in that history, I think the reason that they took them in 1870 was because under that conquest in 1869, the Pope fled Rome. He had to flee because this Kingdom of Italy that was developing in that time period was conquering, defeating the papacy and taking all their papal states. So I'm not trying to make a point about 1860 or 1870. What I want us to see is that this loss of power was progressive. It's not all done in 1798. They still had their papal states in 1798, but they've lost power. They've lost state power. They no longer have the kings of Italy on their side doing their bidding, but they still have little remnants of power. And they lose them progressively. They get weaker and weaker until 1870 when they just lose all of their papal states and they're left as purely a church. So it's a progressive history of what we could term captivity or scattering for the Catholic Church. The whole period is a dark time. They even recognize it themselves. They talk about it as a dark history. So when we compare and contrast what this death looks like, you have Russia. Russia stayed. It never lost its own country, but it's lost all of its power. It's weak, it's vulnerable, and it's pretty much under the dictates of all other countries. It's no longer a superpower. The same thing for the papacy. After 1789, 1799, it's lost all of its power. But that scattering time period it's not all done and dusted there. It's a period of, I would say, about 100 years. So, anyone who hasn't spoken, my brother.
Okay, the question was, you read a quote there and said that the mother died, the daughter has been gaining strength. So, here we will ask ourselves, when did the daughters started gaining the strength? Because we know from 1798 is the beginning, is when God is trying to send an invitation to the Protestant churches. And that is where we can see God separating Seventh-day Adventist Church from the Protestants. And then we enter in the period where there is civil war, there is this crisis of slavery in the United States of America. Now we can see the way the activities of the church there, the way the passing of this slave act that is being passed. And then we see also in 1888, Protestants playing a role, and Ellen White will write a quote saying how is the image of the beast is being formed. And if we can mark the place where we can start the formation of the image of the beast in that period of that dispensation, then we can see how Protestant churches, when they were sent wedding invitation by God to by sending the messengers, they rejected, and now they are starting to stretch their hand to control the state.
I'm not arguing that Protestantism doesn't play a role. We just spent class after class tracing Jerry Falwell on the moral majority. What people are saying is that that's all it is. It's just Protestantism 1850, Protestantism 1888, and now it's just the daughters. That's what I'm suggesting is incorrect. It's 1888, you do have Protestantism doing that work, but she has many quotes warning about the mother. The mother has not suddenly become irrelevant. We're out of time. Do we have a... Yes, brother.
What I wanted to say was, according to the history of World War, so if you see from World War I and World War II, papacy was trying to gain access to the throne. So if you are to replace World War III, it cannot be Protestant. They are still to be the same papacy, which needs to gain victory of everything and then be there. So someone who has not died cannot resurrect. So Protestants cannot resurrect instead of papacy. So it's hard to resurrect.
So I'm not sure if everyone here is aware of what we do with the world wars. But what you've brought us to is particularly World War II. It also happened in World War I, but World War II is easier to see when you see the papacy come into a union with Hitler. So you have a church and a state power. They come together in the history of World War II because the papacy thinks that Hitler will do their bidding, take down Russia. So if we're going to define this loss of power of state power and governments as the deadly wound and death, then we know that they're getting that back, at least in the history of World War II. That's your point. We might close for today and we'll come back and discuss some more, so go away and think about it. Come back with your thoughts, please, and we'll have another discussion. Try to come into unity. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Lord, we know that these are serious subjects. The Sunday law is just before us, and we are trying to understand, Lord, what we must face. I pray, Lord, that you'll give us greater clarity, that we'll understand these things. May we be in unity on them. I pray, Lord, that we'll be following the right external events, that we'll be tracing these things through prophecy and history, Lord, and that nothing would take us unprepared. I pray, Lord, that you'll bless the remainder of our day and our discussions and studies still to come. In Jesus' name, amen.